It was a Monday morning unlike any other in downtown Los Angeles. News helicopters hovered over the courthouse, and a crowd had already gathered along the steps with handmade signs, camera flashes, and eager whispers. The media buzzed with one central question: why was Lady Gaga summoned to federal court? Just 48 hours earlier, Gaga had delivered a passionate speech at a charity event supporting mental health awareness. It was bold, unfiltered, and unapologetically political, especially her criticism of certain state-level restrictions on artistic expression. The crowd at the event had erupted in applause, but not everyone was impressed. Within a day, a legal summons had landed on her doorstep. The plaintiff? The state, citing disruption of public order and abuse of influential speech. The judge assigned to the case? Barbara Lagoa, a stern, by-the-book conservative jurist with a reputation for cutting through celebrity antics. Gaga, known for her eclectic style and defiant presence, arrived at the courthouse in a tailored black suit and minimal makeup, a stark contrast to her usual red carpet persona. This wasn't a performance. This was war. As she stepped out of the black SUV, the murmurs intensified. Paparazzi lenses clicked in rapid fire. Protesters and supporters stood shoulder to shoulder, some chanting her name, others waving signs accusing her of undermining traditional values. Inside the marble-walled courtroom, the air was tense. Every camera was aimed. Every pen was poised. A young assistant handed Gaga a leather folder. Inside it was a copy of the complaint, 5 pages long, filled with legal jargon and accusations that seemed out of place in a democracy celebrated for freedom of speech. Across the room, Judge Lagoa entered with the poise of a monarch. She didn't look at Gaga. Not yet. Instead, she adjusted her robe, placed her reading glasses at the bridge of her nose, and nodded to the bailiff. This court is now in session. The gavel struck once. Gaga remained still. Her hands clasped, her eyes fixed forward. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about every artist who had ever been told to stay in their lane. The prosecution opened with a monotonous but cutting tone. Your Honor, we contend that Miss Germanata, Lady Gaga, used her platform irresponsibly, potentially inciting unrest with her statements. We believe this speech constitutes a misuse of public influence, bordering on civil disruption. Gaga tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is this a criminal proceeding, or are you suggesting civil liability based on the tone of a speech? A slight stir rippled through the courtroom. Gaga's legal team exchanged glances. The judge wasn't buying everything at face value, yet. But then Judge Lagoa turned her gaze toward Gaga. Miss Germanata, she said, voice firm but not unkind. I trust you understand the gravity of this proceeding. This is not a stage and your presence here is not a concert. I suggest you leave the theatrics at the door. There was the first public strike. The courtroom gasped in silent surprise. Gaga didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke quietly to her attorney, then looked back at the judge. There was no smirk, no grand gesture. Just silence, poised and calculated. She would wait. And when she spoke, it wouldn't be performance art. It would be a reckoning. The scene ended not with drama, but with tension so thick it weighed on every shoulder in the room. And just like that, the world held its breath. Tomorrow's headlines wouldn't just report on what happened. They'd define what freedom really meant in modern America. The next morning, courtroom attendance had doubled. International press had flown in overnight, and every major news outlet now ran with variations of the same headline: Lady Gaga versus the state. Speculation was wild. Some argued this was a publicity stunt. Others feared it signaled a dangerous precedent in free speech jurisprudence. Meanwhile, a silent war was brewing within the marble halls of justice, between one of pop culture's most influential voices and a legal system slow to evolve. Inside, the tension from the previous day still lingered. Gaga entered the room flanked by her 2 attorneys, one a sharp constitutional scholar from Harvard, the other a former ACLU litigator known for dismantling political censorship cases. Her outfit remained reserved: navy blazer, simple pearl earrings, a quiet form of resistance through elegance. Judge Lagoa called the court to order promptly at 9 a.m. Today, she announced, we will hear opening arguments and establish whether the case proceeds under constitutional scrutiny or as a civil matter. Her voice echoed with practiced control. The prosecution stood first. Their lead attorney, a state-appointed counsel, began with carefully chosen words. Your Honor, we do not question Miss Germanata's right to speak. What we question is the intent behind that speech. and the impact it has on public institutions. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably. Impact. Intent. Vague terms. Dangerous tools. Gaga remained motionless, her fingers wrapped around the edge of the table. Her eyes didn't move from the judge. Then her lead attorney rose. Your Honor, let us be clear. This case is not about disruption. It is about discomfort. The discomfort of hearing truths spoken plainly. If we begin penalizing discomfort, we criminalize courage. A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Lagoa's face remained unreadable, her pen poised above a legal pad. The state is asking this court, he continued, to treat artistic expression as if it were a grenade. But I say to you, what Gaga threw into the public square was not a grenade, it was a mirror. This time even the judge's brows twitched. The hearing paused for a recess. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled to over 1,000 people. Supporters carried rainbow flags, signs quoting Gaga's lyrics, and banners that read "Words aren't weapons." Meanwhile, a smaller group countered with placards reading "Order over outrage." In a side hallway, Gaga stood quietly beside her attorney. You sure they won't shut it down? She asked. They might try, he replied. But you've already lit the fire. Now we show them where the smoke leads. As they returned to the courtroom, a whisper spread through the hall. Judge Lagoa had requested a private motion session, a rare move that suggested she wasn't entirely certain how to proceed. Inside chambers, she stared at the case file alone, tapping her pen against her desk. She had ruled on drug cases, immigration challenges, even terrorism suspects. But never this. Never a trial that risked rewriting the boundary between law and liberty in the glare of every camera in America. And then she did something unexpected. She invited Gaga to speak, not through lawyers, not through statements, but directly to the court. You may approach, she said. Gasps rose. Gaga stood. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she would speak not as an icon, but as a citizen defending the right to be heard. And the courtroom waited, silent and breathless. The courtroom was frozen in time. Lady Gaga rose slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor like the countdown to something irreversible. The murmurs that had filled the chamber moments before vanished. Reporters lowered their pens. The judge leaned back, a flicker of curiosity breaking her stoic expression. Gaga reached the center of the courtroom. No podium. No legal script. Just her voice, raw and unfiltered. I never wanted to be here, she began, her voice calm but laced with restrained intensity. I never thought that speaking out, about the things we're too afraid to say, would land me in a courtroom defending my right to feel. She paused. Last year I stood on a stage in Nevada and said something simple. That silence protects power and expression threatens it. That sentence sparked this case. Not violence. Not defiance. Just truth. The judge tapped her pen, subtly intrigued. Gaga continued. This courtroom doesn't just hold me. It holds every artist, every journalist, every voice that challenges the comfort of the powerful. And if we call that criminal, then we've already lost the republic. A hush followed. It was not applause that held the room, it was the weight of her words. The judge made a small note on her pad, then raised her hand gently. Miss Germanata, Judge Lagoa said, the court appreciates your willingness to speak directly. You understand, however, that while passion is compelling, we are bound by precedent and procedure. Gaga nodded. Then let precedent be worthy of the people it serves. In the gallery, a teenage girl in a wheelchair wiped tears from her cheeks. A young journalist looked up from his notes, his pen trembling. Back at the prosecution's table, the lead attorney shifted uncomfortably. Gaga had shifted the courtroom's energy, not with performance but with presence. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger. Giant monitors had been set up in nearby parks to stream the proceedings. Hashtags like #Trial of Expression and #Gaga versus the state trended globally. This was no longer a legal matter, it was a cultural referendum. The prosecution tried to regain footing. In cross-examination, they brought up past performances, bold lyrics, controversial fashion choices. They tried to paint a picture of chaos disguised as creativity. But each time they struck, Gaga's legal team responded with surgical precision. You argue intent, her attorney countered. Can you prove it? You argue impact, another followed. Can you quantify it? By mid-afternoon, the case had evolved. This was no longer just Gaga's trial. It was a battle for the soul of artistic freedom and a democracy that claimed to value it. In chambers, Judge Lagoa met briefly with senior clerks. "This is a powder keg," she admitted. "Whatever we rule, it will echo beyond this bench." A clerk nodded. "It already has." Back in the courtroom, the final motion of the day was filed. Gaga's team had requested a First Amendment defense with constitutional urgency. That would elevate the case to potential Supreme Court review. Gasps filled the room once more. Judge Lagoa for the first time looked directly at Gaga, not as a defendant but as a catalyst. She adjourned for the day with a statement no one expected. "The court will convene tomorrow to determine whether this case challenges the Constitution itself. If it does, then it will be treated as such, with the full gravity and scrutiny it deserves." Lady Gaga turned to her team, silent. But her expression was clear. This wasn't just survival. It was a crusade. And it had just crossed the threshold into history. The following morning, the courthouse steps looked like the front lines of a movement. Protesters and supporters were no longer just holding signs, they were singing. 1,000 voices in unison, echoing lyrics Gaga had once penned in solitude, now weaponized into an anthem of resistance. Inside, the atmosphere was different. Tighter. Denser. A line had been drawn and everyone could feel it. Judge Barbara Lagoa entered with a noticeable shift in her posture. Overnight, something had changed. Maybe it was the amicus briefs from human rights groups flooding her clerk's inbox. Maybe it was the barrage of editorials from global newspapers. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the expression in Lady Gaga's eyes the day before, unyielding, unafraid. Court was called to order. "We have a motion before us," Judge Lagoa began, her voice steady but resonant. "It concerns the application of constitutional protections under the First Amendment in a case that has drawn national and international scrutiny." The prosecution objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is not a constitutional case. This is a matter of public conduct, of an individual using fame to bypass civic norms." Gaga's lead attorney, a woman in her early 40s with calm fire in her eyes, stepped forward. "If speaking uncomfortable truths is criminal, then this court isn't defending order, it's defending obedience." Gasps again. Not from the public, but from the press section, where even the most seasoned legal correspondents began scribbling notes at record speed. The judge called for recess, clearly rattled by the weight of what was unfolding. In the hallway, Gaga stood by a window looking out over the crowd. A child held a cardboard sign that read, "Her voice is my voice." She smiled softly. Then her attorney approached. "We found it," she whispered. "A precedent. 1971, Cohen v. California. The Supreme Court ruled that even offensive expression is protected under the First Amendment. It's thin but it's a thread." Gaga didn't blink. "Then we pull it until it unravels everything." Back in session, the defense laid it out, point by point. They argued that Gaga's performances, speeches, and lyrics were not just entertainment, but cultural critique. That her message had not incited violence, but dialogue. That punishing her was not protecting the public, it was policing perception. The prosecution fired back with footage, selectively edited clips of Gaga at concerts, taking bold stances, wearing provocative outfits, challenging norms. But the jury, composed of a mosaic of backgrounds, wasn't reacting how they'd hoped. If anything, the visual onslaught made Gaga look human, brave, unfiltered. Then came the pivot. The defense submitted a digital petition, over 12 million signatures from around the world, calling for the case to be dropped. Among them were artists, Nobel laureates, heads of state, and everyday citizens. Judge Lagoa reviewed the document quietly. Then she did something unexpected. She turned to Gaga. "If the court were to throw out this case, what would you say to those who believe you're above accountability?" Gaga stood. "I would say accountability is not silencing. It's listening. I'm not asking for immunity. I'm asking for honesty." A silence fell again, long, heavy, profound. The judge called another recess. In chambers, her advisors were split. "If you allow this defense," one warned, "you're opening the floodgates. Every public figure will claim artistic intent." "But if I don't," Lagoa replied, "I'm turning the law into a muzzle." As the day closed, Judge Lagoa returned to the bench. "The court will deliberate further before ruling on the constitutional motion. However, this chamber recognizes that the matter before us is not just legal, it is philosophical." She adjourned with a simple sentence: "Truth, however inconvenient, is not a crime." Outside, the crowd erupted, not in chaos but in harmony. Inside, Gaga remained still. This was no longer about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. The next morning, the courtroom was transformed from a battleground into a theater of ideas. Overnight, legal analysts from Harvard to Sao Paulo had picked apart the previous day's proceedings. Social media was flooded with threads dissecting Gaga's testimony, the Cohen v. California precedent, and the judge's powerful closing line. Truth, however inconvenient, is not a crime. Lady Gaga arrived in a dark navy pantsuit. Her hair tied back, her expression composed but unreadable. She passed through the hallway lined with reporters and activists without flinching. There was a fire in her steps, slow, steady, defiant. Inside, Judge Lagoa appeared changed. She wore the same black robe, but something intangible had shifted. Perhaps it was resolve. Perhaps it was reckoning. The court was called to order. This chamber has reviewed the constitutional motion presented by the defense. Before proceeding to final arguments, I will allow both sides to make brief closing statements. The prosecution stood first. In a nation governed by laws, celebrity cannot shield one from consequence. The defendant has blurred the lines between art and activism, between expression and incitement. If we allow this precedent, we allow chaos. And that is not liberty. That is anarchy. Then came the defense. The attorney didn't even glance at her notes. This trial isn't about a woman. It's about a wall. A wall that has stood too long between free thought and public fear. Lady Gaga didn't build that wall. She simply pointed at it. And for that, she was brought here, not because she threatened peace but because she threatened silence. A collective exhale swept through the gallery. Then Gaga herself stood. Permission to speak? Judge Lagoa gave a slight nod. Gaga turned to the courtroom, not the judge, not the jury, but the people. I was told I make people uncomfortable. That my lyrics, my outfits, my opinions are too much. But I ask you, how much is too much truth? How much is too much honesty? If I cannot sing about injustice, what's the point of art at all? She paused. You don't have to agree with me. You don't even have to like me. But you should want me to speak. Because if they silence me today, tomorrow they'll come for the quiet ones too. No one moved. No one breathed. Judge Lagoa called a short recess to deliberate. But everyone knew, this wasn't about deliberation anymore. This was about legacy. In chambers, Lagoa stared out the window. Below, a crowd of thousands waited. Not chanting. Just standing. Holding signs. Candles. Children. Elders. She thought of her own journey, a Cuban-American woman who had climbed the judicial ladder rung by rung, breaking ceilings with every step. She had fought to be heard, respected, seen. And now she was being asked to silence someone else's fight. When she returned to the bench, there was no paper in front of her. No written opinion. Just her voice. The Constitution of the United States protects speech that is uncomfortable, unpopular, and even offensive. It does not exist to protect the agreeable, it exists to defend the edge of the discourse. She turned to Gaga. This court finds the charges against you to be constitutionally unsound. The motion is granted. Case dismissed. The room exploded. Not with chaos, but catharsis. Gaga closed her eyes. Just for a moment. And then she whispered, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to herself. Let them hear us now. Outside, the anthem began again. But this time it wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone. The world didn't wait to react. Within minutes of Judge Lagoa's ruling, the news broke across every major media outlet. Gaga vindicated, read the headline splashed across the New York Times. CNN ran a live ticker with the words, Constitution trumps controversy. But the most striking was a single tweet from a high school student in Minnesota. Today, freedom wore heels and sang her truth. Outside the courthouse, the crowd didn't chant slogans or wave flags. They just sang. Thousands of voices, raw, trembling, out of sync, joined together in Gaga's controversial song. A cappella. Unfiltered. Powerful. Reporters scrambled to reach the legal team, while constitutional scholars were pulled onto primetime panels. But Lady Gaga didn't speak to the press. She slipped out through a side door unnoticed. She wasn't seeking attention now. She had already won something deeper. Permission, not just to speak but to matter. She returned to her hotel room alone. No entourage. No makeup. No camera crew. Just silence and a bottle of red wine. She poured a glass and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, her voice was echoing, not through radio waves but through people. Mothers. Students. Immigrants. Veterans. Misfits. On the other side of town, in her chambers, Judge Lagoa sat in solitude as well. She was reviewing her own ruling, not for errors but for peace of mind. This wasn't the kind of decision that earned awards or praise. If anything, it could cost her appointments, friends, and reputation. But it was the right call. Later that night, the judge received an anonymous letter. It was handwritten in Spanish with careful, almost nervous strokes. My daughter cried today. Not because you ruled in favor of someone famous, but because for the first time she saw someone like her, like us, defend our right to be different. Gracias Jueza. No signature. No return address. Just folded paper and truth. Gaga eventually sat at her grand piano in the suite. She played a soft chord, hesitant. Then another. Slowly, her fingers found their way into something new. Not a song for charts. A melody for the moment. Meanwhile, media firestorms blazed. Politicians tweeted angry takes. Protesters and defenders filled the streets. But the noise, loud as it was, couldn't drown out what had shifted. In homes across America, conversations began. A father asking his son what he really believed. A teacher rethinking how she taught free speech. A teen coming out to her mom during dinner. None of this was televised. None of it viral. But it was real. And it all started in that courtroom. The legal precedent set by Lagoa's dismissal triggered a wave of new discourse. Law schools added the case to their syllabi. Civil rights groups cited it in open letters. For the first time in years, the First Amendment wasn't just an old paragraph. It was a living thing. That night, Lady Gaga went live on Instagram. No glam. No filters. Just her face, tired but defiant. I didn't win today, she said. We did. And not because we were the loudest, but because we didn't stop singing. She paused. And we never will. The following morning, Washington buzzed. Senators issued statements, pundits debated consequences, and Supreme Court clerks quietly studied the ruling with widened eyes. Yet amid all the noise, a subtle cultural shift had already taken root, one not engineered by legislation but born from resonance. Judge Barbara Lagoa arrived at her courthouse with the same poise as every day before. Her hair neatly tied back, black robe in place, expression unreadable. But something in her steps betrayed the weight of knowing. Her decision had unleashed something far greater than expected. Meanwhile, Lady Gaga was walking a different kind of tightrope. She declined all major interviews, ignored talk show invitations, and canceled promotional appearances. Her publicist was baffled. You've never had more leverage, he'd said. Gaga only smiled. I don't want leverage, she replied. I want clarity. She spent the day meeting with a group of young artists in a Brooklyn community center. Poets, dancers, painters, most of them queer or undocumented, all of them navigating a world that rarely listened. They didn't ask for selfies. They asked questions. How do you stay brave when they want you quiet? How do you sing when your voice shakes? She answered honestly. You don't wait to feel brave. You speak before you're ready. Later, Judge Lagoa received a phone call, not from a network or a politician but from her own father. A retired Cuban immigrant who once told her to stay away from anything that made waves. His voice was shaky. I saw the clip, he said in Spanish, the one where they sang. In front of the court. Barbara waited. I was wrong, he continued. About a lot of things. She closed her eyes. That was more than any award. That evening, a prominent law school hosted a panel dissecting the decision. On stage, 3 legal scholars, all male, discussed the implications. They praised the language of the dismissal, the balance of legal precedent, the courage of the court. None of them mentioned the song. In the audience, a young professor raised her hand. You're analyzing the decision. But are you acknowledging the reason it matters? Not just for legal doctrine, but for people who've never seen the Constitution protect them. Silence. Then applause. In Chicago, a trans woman named Danny uploaded a video of herself reading Lagoa's ruling aloud, one paragraph at a time. Her voice trembled, her hands shook. But the comments filled with hearts, clapping emojis, and simply, thank you. The story had outgrown its participants. Lady Gaga wasn't trending anymore. The conversation was. Across platforms, users shared their own verses, poems, protests, and portraits inspired by the ruling. The hashtag Sing Your Truth began to replace outrage with expression. Not because the world had healed, but because someone had shown that the law could still listen. At midnight, Gaga posted a short video. Black screen. Her voice a whisper. Don't be afraid of your voice. Be afraid of silence. And then, nothing. No music. No branding. Just a heartbeat. And across the world people heard it. Not because it was loud. Because it was real. 2 weeks later, the impact of the Supreme Court ruling was no longer confined to headlines. It was showing up in classrooms, protest art, town hall meetings, and even church sermons. Legal scholars argued its boundaries. Political commentators spun its meaning. But for the people, it was personal. In a rural Alabama town, a public high school's choir teacher printed out the ruling and handed it to her students. "I want you to read this. Then write your own response. Doesn't have to be legal. Write it like a song if you'd like." She smiled. "We'll turn the best ones into a performance." In Los Angeles, a mural appeared overnight on the side of an abandoned building. It showed a blindfolded Lady Justice not holding scales, but a microphone. At her feet, a young girl stood with her mouth open in mid-song, her shadow stretching into the shape of the American flag. Barbara Lagoa was shown the mural during a televised interview. The host tried to provoke her. "Do you think this crosses the line, this fusion of law and pop culture?" Judge Lagoa didn't blink. Law has always been shaped by culture. The line isn't between law and art, it's between silence and expression. The clip went viral. Again. Meanwhile, Lady Gaga was in Montana, away from cameras, press, and noise. She rode horseback across wide plains, her phone off, her mind calm. Her team begged her to capitalize on the moment, launch a documentary, release an anthem, speak at the UN. She declined. Her only public statement was a donation, $10 million to grassroots legal aid organizations protecting trans and queer youth in underserved communities. No press release. No name on the banner. Just a handwritten note, "Let them be heard." In New York, a law professor created a new seminar titled Constitutional Courage, When the Law Listens. Students enrolled by the dozens, many of whom had never before felt welcome in legal spaces. They weren't just studying precedent, they were rewriting their relationship to justice. Elsewhere, a quiet moment unfolded. An elderly man in Kansas sat beside his gay grandson, watching the original court hearing on YouTube. When Gaga had spoken about her late friend, the man's grandson looked away, nervous. But the old man said softly, "I'm sorry it took this long." The boy wept. In the corridors of justice, Judge Lagoa continued her duties, never commenting further on the case. But her dissents became more poetic, her rulings more aware. Not softer, sharper. As if something had cleared her vision. One evening, a court clerk found a post-it note on Lagoa's desk. It simply read, "The law doesn't need to sing. But it should never make us mute." The clerk smiled. Folded the note into her pocket. Outside the courthouse, someone was humming. Not a protest. Not an anthem. Just a human voice, unafraid. The world was changing in the quiet. Not through sweeping legislation or executive orders, but through the soft tectonic shift of hearts and minds. And in that silence, new voices emerged, not loud but clear. In Chicago, a 14-year-old transgender teen named Alex stood at a student government debate. The topic, freedom of speech in school environments. When it was Alex's turn, they didn't deliver a fiery speech. Instead, they read aloud the same quote from Lagoa's opinion that had once been ridiculed. "The dignity of voice is constitutional." The room fell silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. And soon, the auditorium echoed with an applause that felt bigger than the room itself. In D.C., a junior senator used his floor time not to argue, but to play a clip from the hearing, the exact moment Gaga had taken the stand, hands trembling, voice steady. It had become symbolic, an artist putting emotion to words that history books had forgotten. At the Supreme Court building itself, tourists began arriving not just to snap pictures, but to pause. Many brought flowers. Some brought letters. One day, a choir from Minnesota stood on the courthouse steps and sang a soft rendition of Born This Way. No signs. No chants. Just song. Judge Lagoa never came to the window. But she heard it. Meanwhile, in Europe, international law journals picked up the ruling. Professors in Paris, Sao Paulo, and Cape Town began assigning the case as required reading, not for the verdict but for its tone. It was being studied not just as law but as narrative. The narrative of permission. Of belonging. Of saying, "You're allowed to exist in the open." Lady Gaga returned to the stage after months of silence. Her first words to the crowd weren't lyrics. They were, "Your breath matters." The arena, filled with 70,000 fans, held its breath. And when the music started, it wasn't one of her hits. It was a brand new piano ballad. No title. No chorus. Just melody and truth. Behind the scenes, a documentary crew captured it all, but under strict instructions not to release it as the Gaga case. Instead, it would be called In the Name of Voice. And somewhere in a legal publishing house, an intern noticed a surge in sales for an old, out-of-print book, Voices in the Courtroom, Emotion and the Constitution. Lagoa had written the foreword under a pseudonym. No one knew. No one needed to. Justice was no longer faceless. It had a voice. And more importantly, it listened. Months later, the Supreme Court chamber sat empty. No arguments, no crowds. Just morning sunlight spilling through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles like golden sparks. Judge Barbara Lagoa sat at her bench, not to preside but to reflect. Her clerk entered quietly, holding a sealed envelope. "It's from the United Nations," he whispered, almost afraid to break the silence. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a formal letter stating she had been nominated for the International Human Rights Jurisprudence Award. Not for her politics. Not for her position. But for redefining the role of empathy in legal reasoning. She placed the letter aside. That evening, she walked home without her security escort for the first time in months. It was drizzling. Umbrella-less, she let the rain touch her face. The city felt different, still noisy, still imperfect, but less suspicious. She stopped at a small bookstore she used to visit before her appointment. In the window was a display titled, Voices That Changed the System. Among the books, In the Name of Voice. She didn't go inside. A group of teenagers on the corner recognized her. One raised a hand, not to protest, not to plead. Just a wave. She waved back. Across the country in New York, Gaga sat on a talk show couch. The host asked, was it worth it? All the courtroom drama, the backlash, the exposure. She smiled, brushing her platinum hair back. You don't walk into fire expecting applause, she said. You do it so someone else knows they can too. The audience erupted in applause, but not the thunderous kind. The kind that carries tears. Back in Washington, a single candle sat on the steps of the Supreme Court building. No name, no sign. Just a whisper in wax. The inscription on the base read, Truth isn't loud. It's steady. And so the world moved forward, step by quiet step. The Constitution remained unchanged. But somehow it felt more human.